Hello, students in Becky White's History of Western Art class. My name is Tom Chung. I run the painting program at UAA and have been teaching here for about 6 years. And I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about art and art history from the perspective of a contemporary artist. And so the first point that I want to address is how history relates to the interpretation of an artwork. And so I'm going to share with you an image of one of my favorite painters, Caravaggio, to talk to you about the inseparability of history and art. And so the first thing for you to understand is that no artist exists within a vacuum. We're not only inseparable from our societies, but we're also a product of our time and our geography. That's always been the case. The earliest art that humans ever created was inspired by the natural features of the surrounding region. For example, you see a lot of vertical triangular patterns up here in Alaska Native art that were inspired by the mountains and the mountain ranges. And so with the right amount of research, you can understand quite a bit, not only about what inspired the artwork, but also sometimes how artworks will actually influence and shape history too. So it's not always a one-way route. So I want to talk a little bit about the situation Caravaggio was in the 1500s when he made this painting, to give you an idea of how the history of the time period, how that would have affected the artwork. So first of all, the content of Caravaggio's paintings was heavily restricted. He was being hired by patrons and the church, and these religious paintings that you find around the time were really a method of propaganda. The Catholic Church was trying to compete with other types of Christianity, and so painters were employed to really promote and elevate the status of the churches. Within a painter's lifetime, what rules the church had for what could be included in artwork or what could not would oftentimes change. And so Caravaggio actually had paintings that he had done that were not accepted by the church because of who he chose as a model, and little details like that. And that's a real contrast to today's artist that is not as restricted by conventions as Caravaggio would have been in the 1500s. The way that I understand artwork now is we are in a postmodern period where no matter what type of art you're interested in, every approach towards truth using art is considered valid now. And so you could be weaving quilts and that's fine art, or you could be presenting photographs and that's considered fine art, or you could be painting like Caravaggio. And sometimes my students get upset that anything can be art these days, but I always reassure them and let them know that just because something's art doesn't mean it's good art or that it's impactful art. So back when Caravaggio was making art, everything could not be art. And it was mainly in painting. You were seeing realism, and that was being restricted to religious and historical scenes. And so it's very different to what the constraints that an artist working today is. So now I'm going to show you a couple images of my artwork and how this relates to a historical context. My great-grandfather was a Christian minister, and I had heard stories that my great-grandmother actually had to hide her Buddha sculpture, and she hired neighborhood children to warn her when my great-grandfather was coming home so she could hide all of the Buddhist imagery and paraphernalia. And to me, that speaks to the era of colonialism, where the West had really dominated the world and non-Western people were not seen as human beings. Non-Western cultures were considered primitive and not valid, even by non-Western people. And so, for a long time, my ancestors, my great-grandparents, my grandparents that immigrated to America, they had to assimilate in order to fit in. So they had to give up their traditional religion, which was Buddhism. They had to give up their traditional language and their culture in order to succeed in America. And that was just how things worked. And this is what this painting is actually about. I talked to my grandmother before she died, and she said that when she immigrated from China to America as a refugee of war, it took 30 days, and she had a glass sculpture of the Chinese goddess of mercy with her. And she said she never put it down the entire voyage because she was afraid that the delicate glass fingers would break. And I made this painting of an American Guanyin, and the whole painting is visually shattered to show that even though my grandma tried very hard to hold on to that sculpture, none of my heritage was really passed on to me. By the time I was born as second generation American, I was taught very little Chinese language, very little Chinese stories, very little Chinese religion, if at all. And because in order to succeed, my ancestors had to speak English and try to fit in as much as possible. And so that's why I made this painting, to show that break. But what's been really uplifting is that within my lifetime, there's been a big change globally in terms of culture. And I see it as an awareness of colonialism and its negative consequences. And it's this time in history, to me, is about the world waking up to the ideal of inclusion, of not forcing people to change to fit in, but to celebrate our differences and what we can bring to the table. And so even in my own day-to-day life, I feel more comfortable being able to wear non-Western clothing and to embrace my own religion. And that freedom comes from my society, partly, that there was a time when, you could be put to death for playing a drum in your house. And so this painting is talking a little bit about this shift from assimilation more to inclusion, and what's possible there culturally. And so in the last 4 years, I've dedicated my life to my studies in Tibetan Buddhism, and my paintings and artwork have reflected that. And so what you're looking at here is my working out of difficult concepts in Buddhism. This is me attempting to articulate the 3 poisons of the mind: greed, hatred, and delusion, which are the fuel for us to transform into becoming better people. And that's what this painting is about. And to me, the bigger deal about this painting is that we're at a moment historically where I can actually celebrate my Chinese heritage, and I can celebrate my my religion that was taken from me and my family for a while. And so obviously, every viewer is going to interpret something different from a work of art, and that's fine. Like I mentioned before, I think of work as visual poetry, and I actually think the strongest artwork is artwork that allows the viewer to reflect themselves into the piece somehow to complete what it means. The next point I want to address is the idea of emotions in art. How do you elicit feeling from a painting? And the easiest way for me to explain this is to talk to you about art as communication. One of the assignments I give to my beginning painting class is to assign them a verb and a painting style. So the verb they pick might be attack, comfort, inspire, or educate. The painting style they pick might be impressionism, surrealism, or cubism. And their task is to come up with an idea that enacts the action, the verb, onto the viewer using the visual format of the art style that they choose. And this is possible because art is communication, a really deep and profound way that humans communicate with each other. And so that exercise allows students to understand the range of what you can psychologically get out of a viewer with the right intention. And I believe that it's the artist's job to make an artwork that is going to be impressive or meaningful to the viewer. I think that's the artist's job. And that's a hard task, especially in this day and age where the average person is exposed to literally thousands of images every single day through their phone and the internet. And studies have shown actually that the more surprising or unexpected something you look at is, the more you're going to pay attention to it. And that's even true for dogs, actually. But I have always kind of tapped into that potential in artwork. And I always encourage my students to try to come up with something that they've never seen before, that is fresh and new in some way. And psychology is really important in artwork as well. My mother was in advertising when I was growing up, and any tactic that an advertising agency uses to get a reaction out of a customer can be exploited in artwork. And so you can evoke nostalgia to make a viewer find more meaning in your artwork. You could use sexuality or beauty to seduce them into the idea that you're trying to communicate. You can use something unexpected occurring. Subverting expectations is something really common both in advertising and art. And so I think that that's a couple aspects of the psychology of art making that's important to keep in mind. This is an example of a painting that I painted as an expression of a strong emotion. I oftentimes think about my paintings almost like they are exorcisms, and that what I paint, I'm able to take out of my mind and put onto a canvas. And so that confuses a lot of people sometimes, because what I want out of my mind is oftentimes very ugly. And people think that the image I'm painting is actually an embrace of that ugliness. But it's actually the opposite. I think that there's a lot of really wonderful things about our society and modern culture, but I think that there's also a lot of really harmful things. And just as a quick example, I grew up in a town where I was in the extreme minority. I was one of the only people in my elementary school that wasn't white. And so I hated the way that I looked, and I hated not being white. And that was not only coming from the kids in the schoolyard coming up to me, pulling their eyelids back and singing racist rhymes. It was also coming from the TV shows that I was watching, and it was in the movies that I was watching. And, the trying to change and have a different worldview is not an easy thing. And so from an early age, I've always used art as actually a tool to help me change the way that I see the world or that I understand something, and also to get things out of me that I think come from society. Because as I mentioned earlier, no artist exists in a vacuum. And that's the reason actually why I do so many self-portraits, is because I have such a complicated emotional relationship with my own face and my own identity. So this piece is called Mother Nature Does Not Love You. And what it represents was this feeling I was finding inside, where I felt like I was being pitted against nature. Here in Alaska, we have we have some very large, notable, dangerous animals. And everywhere I lived before this, the animals were not so deadly. So there was this sort of fear of nature when I moved up here 6 years ago that I never felt. And it reminded me of other times that I felt opposed to nature. And so I wanted to make a painting about that feeling, because I don't think I'm the only person that's ever felt that way. And I think that it's actually a cultural belief. So in this image, I'm shooting two polar bears, and above me, there's text that I needed to use Google Translate to figure out. And it says, Mother Nature does not love you, in Chinese. And so it's just really an expression of that feeling that I didn't want to feel anymore, that I was opposed to nature, is what this painting represents. And I always tell my students that you try to make the work, you try to come up with the ideas and make the paintings that are going to be most emotionally impactful to you. And odds are, even if a viewer doesn't understand what they're looking at, it will be emotionally impactful for them as well. The last point that I want to address is how artwork may be used to help progress society and help educate viewers and assist in informed justice. And really, I believe that artwork is capable of doing anything. But in my own personal life, what's been most meaningful to me is the opportunity to try to help heal society from being less bigoted. Because my early life was so affected by homophobia and racism, it's really my life mission to make things easier for people that come after me in that regard. And so I try to just do everything I possibly can to help in that way. And I'll share you a painting that relates to this passion of mine. This painting I made after white supremacists put up posters at UAA that said, "It's okay to be white." And it was part of a national campaign, and it really unnerved me. And so I wanted to make a painting that highlighted this event. And so there's actually a written description that explains what the inspiration was that gets displayed alongside this. The Anchorage Museum owns this painting. And, I made this for me, but I'm glad that I don't shy away from talking about things like racism, because there are some people that's not their lived experience. So for example, I finished a talk about my artwork once, and an older white gentleman came up to me after and he said, "I was surprised to hear you talk about racism because I never think about it and I don't care." And I remember looking at him and thinking, if it's not an important part of your lived experience, why would you care? Why would you go out of your way to care? And so I try to make artwork to make people go out of their way to care. This painting was displayed at the Anchorage Museum, and a woman came up to me and pointed at the Cleveland Indians logo at the top, and she said, "What's the problem with that logo?" And I said, "Would you want your family to be thought of like this cartoon? Would you want your people to be thought of as this one-dimensional cartoon?" And I just asked her to sit and spend some time looking at it. And I'm really glad actually that that opportunity happened because of the content of my work. So those are just a couple examples of where I've been able to interact with viewers actually and see that the artwork had an educational effect to it. And what's hard as artists is we oftentimes don't know what the consequences of our artwork will be or how it'll be interpreted. But I think that as long as you made an image that's important enough for somebody to respond, react, or lead their life a little differently because of it, I think then, the artist has done their job.